In the spring of 1863, a letter arrived at the White House unlike any other. It did not come from a governor, a senator, or a military officer. It was not written by a wealthy businessman or a powerful newspaper editor. According to records preserved in federal archives, the letter came from a railroad worker, a man few people would have noticed. A man whose name appeared only briefly in payroll ledgers, census records, and local newspapers before history seemed to forget him entirely. Yet somehow, his message traveled hundreds of miles through a nation at war, past military checkpoints, past crowded telegraph offices, past government clerks sorting thousands of documents every week, and against all odds, it reached the desk of President Abraham Lincoln. What happened next puzzled historians for generations. Because Lincoln did something he rarely had time to do during the darkest years of the Civil War. He answered. The reply was short, careful, personal, and hidden inside its few lines was a detail that raised more questions than answers. Why would the President of the United States respond directly to an ordinary railroad laborer? What information did the worker possess that was important enough to catch Lincoln's attention? And why did portions of the story seem to disappear from public memory soon afterward? For more than a century, scattered clues remained buried in old correspondence files, railroad company records, wartime newspapers, and forgotten government documents. Most people never connected them, until researchers began following a paper trail that stretched from a dusty railroad camp to the highest office in America. What they uncovered revealed not only the remarkable life of one forgotten worker, but also a hidden glimpse into how ordinary citizens sometimes shaped history during one of the most dangerous periods the nation had ever faced. The deeper the investigation went, the stranger the story became, because the railroad worker's letter was only the beginning. The real mystery was what happened after Lincoln wrote back. The reply should never have survived. That was the first thing historians noticed when they began piecing together the story. Thousands of letters passed through the White House during the Civil War. Most disappeared into archives. Some were destroyed. Others were lost in fires, floods, and decades of neglect. Yet this particular exchange remained hidden inside a collection of government correspondence that few researchers had examined closely. The railroad worker's name was Thomas Mercer. At least that was the name attached to the surviving documents. He appeared in federal census records as a laborer living near the rail junction outside Cairo, Illinois. Nothing about the record seemed unusual. 32 years old, born in Kentucky, able to read and write, employed by a railroad company supplying Union forces moving through the Mississippi Valley. Just another worker among thousands, at first. But a payroll ledger from late 1862 raised questions. Mercer's name suddenly disappeared for nearly 6 weeks, then reappeared. No explanation was given. No injury was listed, no resignation, no transfer, just an empty gap. Researchers initially assumed it was a clerical error. Then another document surfaced, this one buried inside county court records, a brief statement from a local magistrate. The document referred to Mercer as a witness in a government inquiry. Nothing more, no details, no testimony, no outcome. Just a single sentence confirming his presence. For historians, it was an odd discovery. Railroad workers rarely appeared in wartime government investigations, especially ordinary laborers. Something had drawn official attention toward him. But what? The answer seemed to emerge from a newspaper clipping discovered decades later. The article appeared in a small Illinois newspaper during February 1863. Only 3 paragraphs long, easy to overlook. The reporter described rumors of Confederate sympathizers operating near key rail lines. Authorities feared sabotage. Railroads were becoming the lifeline of the Union war effort. Troops, weapons, food, medical supplies, everything moved by rail. Any disruption could have serious consequences. The article mentioned several unnamed workers who claimed to have witnessed suspicious activity. Their names were withheld. The story vanished from public discussion almost immediately. Yet the timing matched Mercer's mysterious disappearance. Exactly. Suddenly, historians had a possible explanation. Perhaps Mercer had become involved in an investigation. Perhaps he had seen something, but another discovery complicated the picture. A railroad company memorandum uncovered in corporate archives described an incident occurring near a supply depot south of Cairo. The report referenced missing cargo, government cargo, not weapons, not ammunition, something else. Boxes of military correspondence, mail, official dispatches, entire sacks had vanished. No suspects were identified, no arrests followed. The loss embarrassed federal authorities. Worse, it raised alarming questions. Who would steal military mail during wartime? And what information had disappeared with it? The memorandum contained one detail that caught researchers by surprise. A laborer had reportedly alerted supervisors before the theft was discovered. His warning had been ignored. Laborer's name was not recorded, but the timing once again pointed toward Mercer. If true, everything changed. He was no longer a passive witness. He may have been trying to prevent something, yet there was still no explanation for the letter. No reason Lincoln would personally respond. Then another document emerged, this one from the National Archives, a transportation report sent to Washington in March 1863. Most of the report focused on railroad maintenance, routine matters, track repairs, labor shortages, damaged bridges. Then, buried near the end, came a strange notation. An unnamed civilian worker had supplied information considered valuable to military security. No further details were provided. The sentence stood alone. Researchers immediately took notice. Military security. Those two words changed everything. Now Mercer appeared connected to more than missing mail, possibly much more. The deeper historians dug, the more unusual the pattern became. Every document hinted at importance, yet none explained why. It was as if someone had deliberately removed the central pieces of the story, leaving only fragments behind. Then came the first real breakthrough. A historian examining presidential correspondence discovered a copybook entry linked directly to Lincoln's office. The original letter from Mercer was gone, but a summary remained. A clerk had recorded the date, the sender, and a brief description of the contents. Only one sentence survived. The railroad worker claimed to possess information concerning disloyal activities affecting government transportation. That was all. No names, no locations, no specifics, just that single line, yet it was enough. The letter had reached the White House because Mercer believed he had uncovered something serious, something affecting the war, something dangerous enough to contact the president directly. Most citizens would never attempt such a thing. Many would not even know how. But Mercer had done it, and somehow his message passed through layers of bureaucracy, straight to Lincoln. That alone was extraordinary. The president received thousands of letters every month. Few ordinary workers ever received personal attention. Fewer still received replies, yet Lincoln answered. Why? Researchers searched for clues inside the response itself. The surviving copy contained no dramatic revelations, no secret orders, no hidden codes, just a brief acknowledgement. A request for further information, and a statement thanking Mercer for his vigilance. Simple words, almost routine, yet one phrase stood out. Lincoln referred the matter to authorities already familiar with the circumstances, already familiar. Those two words created a new mystery. If authorities were already aware of the situation, why was Mercer writing directly to Lincoln? What had gone wrong? Why bypass local officials? Why take such a risk? The questions multiplied, and the answers remained hidden. Then a witness account surfaced. An elderly veteran interviewed decades after the war described rumors circulating among railroad crews near Cairo. The veteran recalled hearing about a worker who became frightened after reporting suspicious activity. According to the account, the man believed certain local officials could not be trusted. The statement was impossible to verify, yet it aligned with everything else. A worker, a warning, distrust, government attention. A letter to Lincoln. For the first time, a coherent picture seemed possible, but then came a twist nobody expected. Researchers examining county tax records discovered that one prominent landowner repeatedly appeared alongside several names connected to the investigation. The man was wealthy, influential, politically connected, and publicly loyal to the Union, at least on paper. His records intersected with individuals later questioned by federal authorities, again and again. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Historians became divided. Some believed it was coincidence. Others suspected something larger. What made the discovery unsettling was the landowner's reputation. Local newspapers praised him as a patriot. Community leaders respected him. Government officials trusted him. Yet private records seemed to tell a different story. If Mercer had uncovered information involving men like this, the risks suddenly became very real. A laborer accusing powerful figures could lose everything: his job, his reputation, even his freedom. Especially during wartime, then another detail emerged, one that sent researchers back through every document they had collected. Just weeks after Lincoln's reply was sent, Mercer disappeared from railroad records once again, this time for good. No resignation notice, no death certificate, no transfer order, nothing. His name simply vanished. The trail went cold. The man who had written to the president seemed to disappear from history itself. And hidden inside a stack of military correspondence discovered years later was a single unsigned memorandum. It mentioned an unnamed civilian informant. It warned of serious consequences if certain allegations became public. And in the margin, written in faded ink, appeared 4 chilling words: "Protect source until verified." Who was the source? What allegations required protection? And why did federal authorities suddenly fear what might happen if the truth emerged? The answers were waiting inside records nobody had examined for more than a century. And what investigators uncovered next would transform a forgotten railroad worker into the center of a far larger historical mystery. The memorandum should have been routine. Instead, it opened an entirely new path. Federal investigators were not protecting a military officer. They were not protecting a politician. They were protecting a civilian source, a railroad laborer. That fact alone stunned modern historians. Civil War records contain countless reports from generals and government agents. Very few mention ordinary workers in such terms. Even fewer suggest federal protection. Something about Mercer's information had alarmed people in Washington. The next clue surfaced inside records from the War Department. A collection of transportation reports contained several references to unexplained delays along a critical supply route. The delays were small. Hours, sometimes only minutes. Nothing dramatic, yet they happened repeatedly, always in the same region, always near the same junctions. Military officials grew frustrated. The Union Army depended heavily on rail transport. Every delay created risk. Every disruption raised suspicion. At first, investigators blamed poor maintenance, then weather, then inexperienced crews, but the problems continued. Eventually, officials began looking elsewhere. That was when they encountered a troubling pattern. Certain freight manifests seemed to change during transit. Supplies listed at departure did not always match supplies arriving at their destinations. The differences were subtle, easy to miss. A few crates here, several bags there, nothing large enough to attract immediate attention, yet over time the losses accumulated. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Someone was manipulating shipments. The question was who and how. Historians examining these records noticed another detail. Many of the altered shipments passed through areas dominated by large landowners and plantation interests along the Mississippi corridor. Men who publicly supported the Union. Men with influence, men accustomed to power. One plantation owner appeared repeatedly, not as a suspect, not officially, just nearby, always nearby. His name surfaced in contracts, property records, transportation agreements, local government documents. Again and again, researchers could not prove wrongdoing, but they could not ignore the pattern. Neither, it seemed, could federal investigators. Then came a remarkable discovery. An overlooked affidavit buried inside county records. The statement came from an elderly freight clerk interviewed after the war. His testimony described unusual visitors arriving at rail depots after dark. Businessmen, landowners, local political figures, men with authority. Men who did not normally concern themselves with freight operations. The clerk admitted he found their interest strange, especially during wartime, especially when military shipments were involved. His statement ended abruptly. No follow-up questions survived. No conclusions were recorded. Yet historians immediately took notice. The affidavit matched concerns already appearing elsewhere. Someone had been watching the railroads closely, perhaps too closely. As researchers continued digging, another voice emerged from the past. This time it belonged to a formerly enslaved man. His testimony had been recorded years after emancipation. Most of his account focused on plantation life. Hard labor, constant fear, survival, but one passage stood apart. He recalled overhearing discussions among overseers and visitors during the war. The men spoke cautiously, often in whispers. They discussed trains, government cargo, schedules, movements. At the time he did not understand why. Years later he still remembered their anxiety, their tension, their fear of being overheard. The testimony was impossible to verify completely, yet it aligned with other evidence, and it suggested something unsettling. Knowledge about railroad operations may have been circulating far beyond official channels. The implications were serious. Military officials thought so too. One surviving report described concerns regarding information leaks, not sabotage. Not yet information. Someone seemed to know too much. Someone appeared able to predict troop movements and supply schedules with unusual accuracy. That frightened authorities. The Civil War was not fought only on battlefields. Information itself could become a weapon. Then came a mini twist. Historians discovered that Mercer may not have been the first person to raise concerns. Months before his letter reached Lincoln, another railroad employee reportedly filed a complaint. The complaint vanished. No copy survives. No outcome was recorded. Only a brief reference remained in company correspondence. The employee's name was missing, his allegations unknown, his fate uncertain. Researchers suddenly faced a troubling possibility. Mercer may have inherited a problem already known to others, a problem that nobody wanted to confront. And if that was true, his decision to contact the White House became even more significant. Perhaps he believed local authorities would do nothing. Perhaps previous warnings had already disappeared. The theory gained strength when another document surfaced. This one triggered intense debate among historians. A federal investigator reported encountering resistance during interviews. Witnesses became evasive. Records could not be located. Questions went unanswered. Officials who normally cooperated suddenly became cautious. The investigator seemed frustrated. His report contained unusually sharp language. He warned that certain individuals possessed considerable local influence capable of obstructing inquiries. For historians, the statement was explosive. Federal investigators rarely wrote so openly, yet here it was, a warning preserved for more than a century. The deeper researchers looked, the stranger everything became. Then Mercer himself briefly reappeared, not in railroad records, not in government correspondence, in a newspaper, a tiny article, barely noticed at the time. The piece described a disturbance at a public meeting. Nothing violent, just an argument. Witnesses recalled a laborer accusing prominent men of placing personal interests above the Union war effort. No names were printed. The laborer was removed. The meeting continued. Most readers probably forgot the story by the next day. Historians did not. The timing matched perfectly. The location matched too. Could the laborer have been Mercer? No proof existed, but the possibility lingered. And if it was Mercer, his behavior revealed something important. He was no longer quietly observing. He was becoming vocal, dangerously vocal. That may explain what happened next. Several weeks after Lincoln's response, government correspondence suddenly intensified. More reports, more inquiries, more references to transportation security. The pace accelerated. Someone in Washington was paying attention. Then another curious detail emerged. A Union officer stationed near the rail corridor wrote privately about reliable civilian information that had recently reached federal authorities. He never identified the source. He never explained the information, but he described its arrival as significant. Significant. That word appeared repeatedly, yet no document explained why. It was as if investigators kept circling around a secret without ever writing it down, or perhaps those pages simply no longer existed. Either possibility troubled historians. Then came one of the most emotional discoveries in the entire case. A veteran conductor's account recorded decades after the war. The man remembered hearing rumors about a railroad worker who became frightened for his safety, not because of Confederate raiders, not because of battlefield dangers, because of local men he believed had influence, men he believed were watching him. The conductor never identified the worker. Yet his description aligned closely with Mercer. According to the account, the worker became increasingly cautious, avoiding familiar routes, changing routines, looking over his shoulder. The conductor recalled feeling unsettled. Even years later, historians were struck by the detail. Fear leaves traces, and this account carried the unmistakable feeling of someone remembering genuine concern. Then another twist emerged. Researchers finally identified a government official connected to the case. A transportation inspector. His reports appeared throughout the investigation. He interviewed witnesses, reviewed records, examined freight operations, and then unexpectedly he vanished from the file. His reports stopped. His name disappeared. No explanation was given. No successor was identified. Nothing, just silence. The disappearance mirrored Mercer's own. Two men connected to the same mystery, both suddenly absent, both leaving behind unanswered questions. Historians found the coincidence difficult to ignore. Yet the most unsettling discovery was still waiting. Inside a collection of military papers, researchers uncovered a coded reference to an ongoing inquiry. Most of the document remained routine. Then came a brief notation, 4 words, short, simple, easy to overlook. Source remains endangered locally. The phrase shocked researchers. Endangered, not unreliable, not mistaken, endangered. Federal officials apparently believed the threat was real, and they believed it came from nearby. That single notation transformed the entire story. Mercer was no longer merely a curious railroad worker who wrote a letter. He may have become a protected informant, a man caught between powerful interests and federal investigators, a man carrying information important enough for Washington to take seriously. Yet nobody knew exactly what he had uncovered. The central secret remained hidden. And then historians found a forgotten ledger from a rail depot warehouse. Most entries were ordinary, dates, cargo counts, routine transactions, but near the back of the ledger appeared a notation written in a different hand. A shipment had been inspected following information supplied by a civilian source. The inspection produced results described only as confirmed irregularities. No details followed, no explanation, just those 2 words, confirmed irregularities. For researchers, it was the strongest evidence yet that Mercer had been right about something. Very right. The problem was no longer whether he discovered something unusual. The problem was determining exactly what it was. And hidden within another unopened archive box sat a document that appeared capable of answering that question. A document nobody had connected to Mercer before. A document bearing the seal of a federal inquiry. And according to the index card attached to it, the file contained the names investigators had spent months trying to uncover. The file had survived, barely. Its cover was worn. Several pages were missing. Water stains covered parts of the text, yet enough remained to change the entire investigation. Historians opening the file expected names. Instead, they found interviews, dozens of them, railroad employees, warehouse clerks, conductors, inspectors, laborers. Most statements seemed ordinary at first. Then a pattern emerged. Witness after witness described the same concern, not theft, not sabotage, access. Certain civilians appeared able to obtain information they should never have possessed, train schedules, military cargo details, shipment routes, inspection timetables. The information moved quietly, yet it moved, and nobody seemed able to stop it. Federal investigators became increasingly alarmed. One report described the situation as persistent and organized. Those words carried weight, especially during wartime. The concern was no longer isolated mistakes. Something systematic appeared to be happening, something larger. Then historians found the first direct connection to Mercer. A witness mentioned a laborer who repeatedly warned supervisors about suspicious conversations occurring near freight offices. The laborer was not identified by name, but the timeline matched. The location matched. Everything pointed toward him. According to the statement, his warnings generated irritation rather than action. Supervisors dismissed his concerns. Some reportedly laughed. Others advised him to stay quiet. That reaction raised a troubling question. Were they unconcerned or afraid? The distinction mattered, because another interview hinted at something darker. A depot clerk described unusual pressure from prominent local businessmen. The men frequently requested information about government shipments. They presented innocent explanations, business needs, transportation planning, routine commerce. Yet the requests became increasingly specific, too specific. The clerk admitted feeling uncomfortable. Years later, historians reading his testimony felt the same. Then came a mini twist. The names investigators hoped to uncover were indeed inside the file, but not where expected. Most appeared only as initials, single letters. Abbreviations, fragments, almost as though someone intentionally obscured them. Researchers were frustrated. The answers seemed close, yet remained just out of reach. Still, one set of initials appeared repeatedly. 3 letters, again and again, attached to freight contracts, property transactions, rail access agreements. Investigators clearly considered the individual important, very important. Modern historians spent years attempting identification. Eventually, they succeeded. The initials belonged to a wealthy plantation owner operating near the Mississippi River, a respected figure, a donor to Union causes, a man praised in newspapers, a man with extensive transportation interests, and a man who suddenly appeared everywhere investigators looked. His reaction to federal scrutiny was preserved in a remarkable document, a letter written to a business associate. The plantation owner complained bitterly about government interference, described investigators as troublesome, distrustful, unwelcome. His language was careful, but his frustration was unmistakable. Historians immediately noticed the timing. The letter was written shortly after Mercer's correspondence reached Washington. Coincidence, perhaps, but it felt increasingly unlikely. Meanwhile, another group watched events unfold with growing anxiety. Enslaved laborers living on plantations near the rail corridor. Fragments of testimony survived in later interviews. Several men recalled unusual tension among overseers during 1863. Visitors arrived unexpectedly. Meetings occurred after dark. Conversations stopped when workers approached. One former enslaved man remembered hearing repeated references to trains and government inspectors. At the time, he understood very little. Yet decades later, he still remembered the nervous atmosphere. Fear leaves marks, even when details fade. Federal authorities sensed the tension as well. Investigators expanded their inquiries. More interviews followed, more records were collected, and more resistance appeared. A transportation officer wrote that certain witnesses suddenly became unavailable. Some left the area, others claimed memory failures, others simply refused cooperation. The officer sounded increasingly frustrated. His reports became sharper, more urgent. One passage stood out. He warned that influence and local loyalties were complicating efforts to determine the truth. Complicating, a careful word, perhaps too careful. Then historians encountered something unexpected. A second letter, not from Lincoln, not from Mercer, from a federal clerk. The letter referred indirectly to the original complaint, and it contained a detail never previously noticed. Mercer's information had been corroborated. Corroborated. The word electrified researchers. For years, historians debated whether Mercer had simply reported suspicions. Now evidence suggested federal authorities verified at least part of his claims. He had not imagined the problem. He had identified something real. But what exactly had he uncovered? The answer remained hidden. Then another discovery deepened the mystery. Investigators located records of surprise inspections conducted along the rail line shortly after Lincoln's response. Several depots were searched, documents reviewed, cargo examined, employees questioned. The inspections produced unusual findings, not dramatic findings, not enough for headlines, but enough to concern authorities, enough to justify continued investigation. One inspector described the results as disquieting. Another referred to repeated irregular practices. The language remained vague, painfully vague, yet the concern was obvious. Something was wrong. The problem was proving it. Then came one of the strangest moments in the entire story. A military officer submitted a report describing an anonymous source who continued supplying information after federal inquiries began. Anonymous source, not Mercer, someone else. The revelation stunned historians. For years Mercer seemed isolated. Now evidence suggested he may not have been alone. Others were watching. Others were reporting. Others were frightened. Suddenly the mystery grew larger. Perhaps Mercer was only one part of a broader network of concerned civilians. Perhaps multiple workers noticed the same problem. The possibility changed everything. Yet another twist followed. The anonymous report stopped abruptly. No explanation survived. No farewell, no closure, just silence, exactly as happened with Mercer. Historians could not ignore the similarity. Two informants, both active, both useful, both disappearing from the record. The pattern felt unsettling. Then investigators uncovered testimony from a Union veteran who served as a guard along the rail corridor. His recollections were recorded decades later, most focused on routine duties, but one memory remained vivid. He recalled seeing federal agents questioning local businessmen. The encounters were tense. The businessmen appeared angry, offended, humiliated. The veteran remembered hearing arguments about loyalty, about patriotism, about accusations. The atmosphere disturbed him. Because these were respected men, prominent men, men nobody expected to face suspicion. Yet suspicion had arrived anyway, and it was spreading. By late 1863, concern reached levels few people appreciated at the time. The surviving documents reveal mounting anxiety inside government circles. Not panic, something quieter, more dangerous. Uncertainty. Investigators suspected a problem. Evidence suggested a problem. Witnesses described a problem. Yet no single piece of proof seemed large enough to expose the full picture. The truth remained fragmented, scattered across dozens of records. Then historians discovered perhaps the most emotional testimony of all. A railroad worker described the atmosphere among laborers after federal inquiries became known. Men grew cautious. Conversations became shorter. Rumors spread quickly. Some workers feared dismissal. Others feared retaliation. Many simply wanted no involvement. The worker recalled one colleague who became unusually withdrawn, avoiding gatherings, avoiding attention, avoiding questions. The colleague's identity was never recorded. Yet historians immediately wondered, could this have been Mercer? Had he realized how dangerous the situation had become? Had he understood the risks of writing to the president? If so, his actions suddenly seemed even more remarkable because he kept going. The records proved that, even after warnings, even after resistance, even after pressure, the investigation continued. Then came the discovery nobody expected. At the back of the federal inquiry file sat a loose document inserted years later. Different paper, different handwriting, different era. It was a note from an archivist. The archivist had spent years organizing Civil War records, and during that process he encountered something unusual. Several related documents appeared to be missing, not destroyed, missing. The distinction mattered. The archivist specifically identified witness statements and correspondence connected to transportation security investigations. He sounded puzzled, almost troubled. Researchers reading the note felt the same. Why were the documents gone? Who removed them? And when? No answers existed, only questions. Yet the missing records seemed concentrated around the exact period involving Mercer. That fact was impossible to ignore. The closer historians came to the truth, the more gaps they discovered. Almost as though someone long ago decided certain details should not remain together. Then, buried inside a separate archive hundreds of miles away, researchers found a final clue. A transportation investigator had drafted a confidential summary. Most of the report remained sealed for decades. When finally examined, one sentence stood out above all others. The investigator believed the information originally supplied by the civilian source had exposed connections reaching beyond railroad operations. Beyond railroad operations. The phrase stopped historians in their tracks. Mercer may not have uncovered a transportation problem. He may have uncovered something much larger, something involving powerful men, something involving wartime loyalties, something federal authorities hesitated to describe openly. And attached to the summary was a list of individuals scheduled for further questioning. One name appeared at the top. The same plantation owner whose initials haunted the investigation from the beginning. And next to his name, written in faded ink, were two words that changed everything. Priority interview. The designation was impossible to overlook. Priority interview. Federal investigators had reviewed dozens of names, yet only one appeared marked so clearly. The plantation owner had moved from the edge of the story to its center. Historians immediately began searching for the interview itself. What they found was unexpected. The interview had occurred, but only fragments survived. Several pages were missing, others had been heavily damaged. Entire sections were unreadable, yet enough remained to reveal the atmosphere, and the atmosphere was tense. The investigators' notes described a cooperative witness at first, calm, confident, respectable. The plantation owner answered questions carefully. He denied wrongdoing, denied unusual activity, denied knowledge of transportation irregularities. Nothing remarkable, at least initially. Then the tone shifted. The questions became more specific. The answers became shorter. The investigator's handwriting grew sharper, more hurried, almost urgent. Something had changed. Unfortunately, the missing pages began precisely at that moment. The most important exchange had vanished. Researchers could only speculate, but the next surviving page contained a startling detail. The interview had been suspended unexpectedly. Not concluded, suspended. That single word fascinated historians. Interviews were normally completed. Why stop midway? What had occurred? The file offered no explanation, only silence. Then came another unsettling discovery. A federal transportation officer submitted a separate memorandum only days later. He warned superiors that several witnesses appeared to be coordinating their statements. Coordinating. The accusation was serious. The officer believed similarities between testimonies were too consistent to be accidental, not proof, but enough to trigger concern. His frustration was obvious. He repeatedly requested additional authority, additional personnel, additional time. The request suggested a growing problem. Investigators were encountering obstacles, and those obstacles were slowing everything. Meanwhile, records from the region reveal a strange atmosphere spreading through local communities. Newspaper editors began publishing unusually defensive articles. Business leaders publicly emphasized loyalty to the Union. Prominent citizens issued statements supporting the war effort. The timing caught historians' attention. Many of these declarations appeared shortly after federal inquiries intensified, almost as though people sensed scrutiny. Almost as though reputations suddenly felt vulnerable. Then came a small but significant twist. For years, historians assumed Mercer disappeared after writing to Lincoln. That assumption turned out to be wrong. A newly discovered payroll ledger revealed his name one final time. Not in Illinois, not near Cairo, hundreds of miles away. The entry was brief, just a single month's pay, nothing more, yet it changed everything. Mercer had not vanished immediately. He had relocated. The discovery triggered enormous excitement among researchers. For decades they believed the trail ended. Now it continued. The question became why. Why leave? Why travel so far? And why did the record stop again afterward? No answers appeared, only another mystery, yet the timing felt significant. Mercer's relocation occurred shortly after federal investigators classified their source as endangered locally. The connection seemed difficult to ignore. Some historians suspected informal protection. Others disagreed. The debate continues. Then another witness emerged from the archives, a former Union quartermaster. His account survived inside a pension file. Most of his testimony focused on supply operations, routine matters, bureaucratic matters. Then one passage stood apart. He recalled an investigation involving civilians with access to military transportation information. The quartermaster admitted concern, not because the information was reaching enemy armies directly, because nobody knew how far it was spreading. That uncertainty troubled officials deeply. The Civil War generated endless rumors. Most proved false, but transportation intelligence was different. Even partial information carried value, especially along critical supply routes. The quartermaster remembered heated discussions among officers. Some demanded aggressive action. Others urged caution. Nobody wanted to accuse respected citizens without proof, yet doubts continued growing. The balance between suspicion and evidence became increasingly difficult to maintain. Then historians uncovered a remarkable newspaper article, published months after Mercer's letter. The article described federal inspections across transportation networks in several states. Most readers likely overlooked it. Nothing sensational appeared, no arrests, no dramatic revelations, yet one sentence stood out. Authorities believed recent civilian reports had contributed to the investigations. Civilian reports, plural. Again, the possibility emerged that Mercer was not alone. Perhaps multiple citizens had spoken. Perhaps several men independently noticed the same patterns. If true, the implications were profound. Because separate witnesses strengthen credibility. Investigators knew that, and so did historians. Then came one of the most emotional moments in the surviving record. A formerly enslaved man provided testimony years after the war regarding conditions near a river plantation connected indirectly to the inquiry. He remembered fear among laborers, not fear of battle, not fear of raids, fear of conversations. Visitors arrived frequently. Meetings occurred behind closed doors. Workers sensed tension but understood little. The witness recalled hearing one overseer warn another to be careful about loose talk. The phrase remained vivid decades later. Historians took notice. Loose talk about what? Nobody knew, but the statement aligned with everything else. Information, movement, secrecy. The same themes appeared again and again. Then the investigation encountered another dead end. Researchers finally located records relating to the transportation inspector who disappeared from the file. The findings were frustrating. His career continued elsewhere. His government service remained active. Nothing scandalous appeared, nothing dramatic, yet one detail stood out. He never again worked transportation security cases, not once. The shift seemed unusual. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps not. Historians remained divided, but the timing raised eyebrows. Then came a discovery that genuinely surprised researchers. The plantation owner at the center of suspicion was never charged with any crime, never arrested, never publicly accused. His reputation remained largely intact. That fact puzzled historians. How could someone appear so frequently in the records without formal consequences? The answer seemed hidden inside another federal report. The report described a recurring problem: evidence, specifically the lack of definitive evidence. Investigators repeatedly encountered suspicion, patterns, connections, yet proving intent remained difficult, very difficult. The officer writing the report sounded exhausted, almost resigned. He believed concerns were legitimate, but legitimacy and proof were not the same thing. The distinction mattered, especially during wartime. Then another mini-twist emerged. A separate set of records suggested authorities may have achieved part of their objective anyway. Transportation irregularities declined sharply after the investigations. Not disappeared, declined. The change was noticeable. Even historians who disagreed about other aspects of the case acknowledged this. Something altered behavior, whether through fear, scrutiny, or coincidence remained unclear, but conditions improved. That improvement may explain why parts of the investigation quietly faded. The immediate danger appeared reduced. Attention shifted elsewhere. The war continued. Larger crises demanded focus. Yet Mercer himself remained elusive. Researchers still lacked a complete explanation for his role until a final document surfaced, hidden inside correspondence between federal officials. The letter referenced the original civilian source, not by name, never by name, but the context was unmistakable. The official described the source as unusually persistent, determined. Reliable, those words mattered, reliable. After years of speculation, federal authorities had effectively revealed their opinion. They trusted him, at least enough to act, at least enough to investigate, at least enough for Lincoln's administration to pay attention. The realization hit historians hard. Mercer was not a mistaken laborer chasing rumors. He had been taken seriously at the highest levels, yet one mystery remained unresolved, perhaps the biggest mystery of all. What became of him? The records still refused to answer. After that final payroll entry, the trail vanished again. No death certificate, no census match, no military record, nothing definitive. The man who sparked federal concern simply faded from history, but researchers were not finished. Because during a search of land records and post-war legal documents, they uncovered something astonishing. A name, not Thomas Mercer, another name, a different identity appearing in a different state. An identity connected to the same age, the same birthplace, the same occupation, and attached to the record was a signature that looked remarkably familiar. If historians were correct, the railroad worker who wrote to Abraham Lincoln may not have disappeared at all. He may have been living under another name, and the document containing that signature would force researchers to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the end of his story. The signature was not perfect. More than a decade separated the documents. Handwriting changes, ink fades, records deteriorate. Yet when historians placed the signatures side by side, the similarities were difficult to ignore. The shape of certain letters matched, the spacing matched. Even the unusual flourish beneath the surname appeared remarkably similar. Researchers became cautious. They knew handwriting alone could not prove identity, but it was enough to continue searching. And what they discovered finally brought the mystery into focus. The new records belonged to a railroad employee living in Missouri during the years after the Civil War. The man's background closely resembled Mercer's. His age matched, his birthplace matched, his occupation matched. Most importantly, his movements appeared to align with the final payroll entry discovered years earlier. For the first time, historians could trace a plausible path forward. Thomas Mercer may have survived. He may have started over, and he may have spent the rest of his life avoiding the attention that once followed him. That possibility changed the emotional weight of the story, because the record suggested something else. Mercer never sought recognition, never published his account, never claimed credit, never attempted to profit from his role. He simply disappeared into ordinary life. That fact impressed many researchers. In an age when newspapers celebrated heroes and political figures, the man at the center of this mystery chose silence, perhaps deliberately, perhaps necessarily. The reasons remain unknown, but the documentary trail revealed one final series of clues, and those clues finally explained why Lincoln's administration had taken the railroad worker seriously. The answer was not a dramatic conspiracy, not a secret army, not a hidden plot to overthrow the government. The truth was both simpler and more revealing. Federal investigators eventually concluded that sensitive transportation information had indeed been circulating among civilians who had no legitimate need to possess it. Not all of those individuals were disloyal. Not all intended harm. Some were businessmen. Some were landowners. Some were politically connected figures accustomed to access and influence. Yet their actions created real risks. Information moved from person to person. Rumors became knowledge, knowledge became opportunity, and opportunity became danger during wartime. The government understood that. Mercer understood it too. That appears to be what separated him from many others. He recognized the pattern before officials fully grasped its extent, and instead of remaining silent, he acted. The surviving evidence points consistently in that direction, not perfectly. Historical mysteries rarely offer perfection. But consistently, the civilian source, the corroborated information, the federal investigations, the transportation inspections, the concern expressed by military authorities, all of it points toward a laborer who noticed something troubling and refused to ignore it. Historians studying the case often describe that as the most remarkable part, not the letter itself, not Lincoln's reply. The decision to speak, because Mercer occupied a vulnerable position. He possessed little wealth, little influence, little protection. The powerful men mentioned throughout the investigation held advantages he did not: political connections, property, status, community standing. Yet the records show federal officials repeatedly taking the laborers' information seriously. That alone tells a story. Then came a final mini-twist. Researchers eventually identified the likely reason several key documents disappeared. Not suppression, not destruction, misfiling. The explanation disappointed some observers, but historians welcomed it because it fit the evidence. Civil War records were moved repeatedly across decades. Entire collections changed locations. Boxes were reorganized. Indexes rewritten. Documents separated from original files. The process created countless archival mysteries. In Mercer's case, important pieces simply drifted apart over time. That realization allowed researchers to reconnect fragments long believed lost. And when those fragments finally came together, the larger picture emerged. A picture that felt surprisingly human. The plantation owner at the center of suspicion was never proven guilty of criminal conduct. The records do not support such a conclusion. What they do reveal is a man whose activities drew legitimate attention from investigators. A man operating within networks of influence that worried federal authorities. A man who found himself uncomfortably close to an unfolding inquiry. For historians, that distinction matters. The goal is not certainty where certainty does not exist. The goal is understanding, and understanding came from the records themselves. The investigators were concerned. The concerns were real. The inquiries were genuine. The witnesses existed. The documents survived. And at the center stood an ordinary railroad worker. As researchers continued examining post-war records, another emotional detail surfaced. Several former railroad employees remembered Mercer, or a man they believed was Mercer, as quiet and cautious, not fearful, not bitter, simply reserved. One account described a worker who rarely discussed the war despite having lived through important events. The description felt familiar, perhaps too familiar. Historians could never prove it was him, yet the possibility lingered. A man who once wrote directly to Abraham Lincoln may have spent the rest of his life avoiding attention. There is something profoundly human about that. History often celebrates generals, presidents, industrialists, political leaders, yet many important moments begin with people whose names barely survive, people working ordinary jobs, people paying attention, people willing to report what others overlook. Mercer's story appears to belong in that category. Then came the final piece, a letter preserved among government correspondence, not Lincoln's letter, another one. Written years later by a federal official reflecting on wartime investigations. Most of the document discussed administrative matters. Then one passage stood out. The official praised unnamed civilian informants who provided valuable assistance during difficult periods of the war. He noted that many would never receive public recognition. Many would never appear in history books, yet their contributions mattered. The passage was brief, easy to miss. But historians reading it immediately thought of Mercer, because his story fit perfectly. No monuments carried his name, no biographies preserved his memory, no public celebrations marked his actions. For generations he vanished into forgotten records, until scattered clues brought him back. That, in many ways, is what makes the story remarkable. Not because every question was answered. Some never will be. Historians still debate details. They still argue over identities. They still search for missing records. The mystery is not completely solved, and perhaps it never will be, but enough evidence survives to reveal something meaningful. In the middle of the Civil War, an ordinary railroad worker believed he had discovered a problem affecting the nation's transportation system. He gathered the courage to write directly to the White House. His message reached Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln responded. Federal authorities investigated. And traces of those events remained hidden in archives for more than a century. The story reminds us how fragile history can be. A misplaced document, a damaged file, a forgotten ledger, and an entire life nearly disappears. Yet sometimes the record survives just long enough, just clearly enough, for the past to speak again. And when it does, the voices we hear are not always famous ones. Sometimes they belong to railroad workers, laborers, witnesses, men whose names were almost lost. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten stories hidden inside real historical records, consider subscribing for more journeys into the mystery's history nearly left behind.